You belong in my bed, not the streets, Mountain Man declared to the obese homeless girl. The storm raged down Main Street of Leadville, snow whipping sideways across the wooden storefronts and dim lanterns. The town had gathered anyway, pressing against the saloon porch to watch the spectacle of cruelty unfolding. At the center of it knelt Eleanor, a young woman with a round figure, her dress threadbare, her cheeks raw from the cold. She clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders, her stomach hollow from days without food. But the hunger was not as sharp as the shame. "Get out of here, girl!" Sheriff Croft barked, his breath clouding in the icy air. "This town doesn't feed strays. Not dogs, not beggars, and certainly not the fat daughter of a dead drunk miner." The crowd laughed. Some men tossed snow at her, others muttered insults. A boy snatched her bundle of rags and flung it into the street. Eleanor's face burned. She wanted to disappear into the storm, but her body betrayed her, too slow, too heavy to move, before another round of laughter erupted. Then the laughter died. From the far end of the street a man emerged through the curtain of snow. Broad-shouldered, clad in a buffalo hide coat with a beard thick as the forest pines, he moved with the certainty of someone who belonged to no one. His name was Jedediah Kane, a mountain man who lived far from town, feared by some, respected by few, spoken of only in whispers. He stopped before Eleanor. The townsfolk expected him to jeer, to add his voice to the mockery. Instead, his words split the night. "She belongs in my bed," Jed declared, his voice rough as gravel, "not in the streets." A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to still. Sheriff Croft's sneer faltered. Eleanor froze, her breath caught between terror and the faintest spark of hope. And with one brutal sentence, everything changed. The crowd could hardly believe what they had heard. Sheriff Croft's face twisted with contempt, his hand hovering near the pistol on his belt. But Jedediah Kane didn't flinch. He bent, lifted Eleanor to her feet as though she weighed nothing at all, and wrapped his heavy buffalo hide coat around her trembling shoulders. The sheriff scoffed. "You'll regret that, Kane. She's nothing but a burden." Jed's eyes, dark and steady, held the man's gaze. "Better a burden worth carrying than the rot you call justice." Then, without waiting for permission or blessing, he guided Eleanor to his waiting sled, the horses stamping impatiently against the snow. The townsfolk parted in silence. No one dared stop him. With a flick of the reins, Jed carried her away into the storm, the bells on the harness jingling faintly until they vanished into the white wilderness. Eleanor sat stiffly, clutching the coat around her. Heat from his body lingered in the heavy fur, but she couldn't banish the cold inside her chest. Shame gnawed at her. She had been humiliated before an entire town. Now she was alone with a man she did not know, a man of imposing size who spoke few words and inspired fear in most. Her mind spun with questions. Why had he claimed her so boldly? What did he mean when he said she belonged in his bed? Was she truly rescued, or had she simply been taken from one cruelty into another? Jed seemed to sense her unease. As the sled slid over the snowdrifts, he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "Don't mistake my words in town. I said them to shut Croft up, nothing more. You're safe with me. You'll have my bed until you've strength again. I'll sleep by the fire." His tone held no mockery, no lust, only plain truth. For Eleanor, survival had meant silence. Ever since her father died in a mining collapse and her mother wasted away, she had drifted on the edge of town like an unwanted ghost. Her body drew ridicule, her hunger drew suspicion, and her presence drew scorn. She had learned not to look men in the eye, not to answer insults, not to hope. But Jed was different. He hadn't mocked her, hadn't turned away. He had stood against an entire crowd and declared her worth protecting. That single act cracked something in her heart, something she wasn't sure could ever be mended, but now dared to stir. By the time the sled reached the base of the mountains, night had deepened. The forest closed around them, branches heavy with snow. Jed guided the horses with practiced ease. The trail narrow and treacherous, but his hands never wavered on the reins. Eleanor stole glances at him beneath the fur hood, his jaw rough with beard, his brow furrowed in quiet concentration, his presence as solid as the mountains themselves. At last the cabin appeared, a sturdy log house half buried in snowdrifts, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. The sight stole Eleanor's breath. To her it looked like salvation. Jed halted. The team jumped down and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her chilled fingers in his. His grip was firm, steadying. "This is my home," he said simply, "and for now, it's yours too." Eleanor stepped across the threshold, the warmth of the hearth wrapping around her. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something more than shame or hunger. She felt the faint, impossible whisper of belonging. The storm had not lessened. By the time Jed had stabled the horses and carried Eleanor's small bundle inside, the wind screamed like a living thing, rattling shutters and pelting snow against the cabin walls. Inside, warmth radiated from a broad stone hearth. The flames crackled, sending shadows dancing across shelves lined with jars of dried beans, herbs, and smoked venison. Eleanor stood frozen near the door, snow melting in her hair, unsure if she should move further in. Jed set her bundle on the wooden table, then shrugged off his buffalo hide coat and hung it on a peg. Without a word, he brought a wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. "Sit by the fire," he said. "You're frozen through." His voice carried no judgment, only certainty. She obeyed, lowering herself onto a rough-hewn stool. Heat seeped into her bones, thawing the numbness in her fingers. For the first time in days, she felt warmth that wasn't fleeting. Jed moved with quiet efficiency. He filled a pot with water from a pail tossed in chopped carrots and potatoes, and added strips of dried elk meat. The smell of stew soon filled the cabin, rich and comforting. Eleanor's stomach growled loud enough to startle her. She flushed, lowering her gaze. Jed glanced over but said nothing. Instead, when the stew was ready, he ladled a generous portion into a tin bowl and placed it in her hands. "Eat." She hesitated, unsure if she should wait for him, but hunger overpowered shame. She tasted the broth, hot, salty, alive with flavor. Tears blurred her eyes as she ate. She could not remember the last time she had been served first. Jed ate after her, slower, quieter, as though he were making sure she had enough. When they finished, he poured her warm water from the kettle and set a small bar of soap beside it. "You'll want to wash," he said, pointing toward a wooden screen near the back wall that offered privacy. "There are clean blankets on the bed." Her eyes widened. "The bed?" He nodded. "You'll take it. I'll sleep by the fire." She shook her head quickly. "I can't take your Eleanor." He interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've been on the street. You need rest. The bed is yours." Her protest faltered on her lips. She carried the water behind the screen, scrubbing away the grime of the streets, then slipped between quilts that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of Jed stoking the fire, the crackle of logs, the howl of the storm outside. Eventually, sleep claimed her. The days that followed were strange and tentative. Jed rose before dawn, his movements quiet as he split wood outside, his breath steaming in the cold air. Eleanor would wake to find the fire already blazing and a bowl of porridge waiting on the table. He never demanded thanks, never asked for repayment. At first, she felt like an intruder. She kept her eyes down, her words few, afraid she would break whatever fragile peace existed here. But Jed was patient. He showed her how to sweep snow from the roof, how to feed the hens that clucked in a small pen behind the cabin, how to carry water from the frozen creek. When her hands fumbled or her strength faltered, he never mocked her. He simply adjusted her grip, steadied the bucket, or said, "Try again." In the evenings when the chores were done, they sat by the fire. Jed mended tools or sharpened his knife while Eleanor sewed a torn sleeve with thread he provided. Sometimes she hummed softly without realizing. One night Jed looked up from his work. "You've a good voice," he said. She blushed, dropping her gaze unused to kind words. Slowly the cabin became more than a shelter from the storm. It became a place where silence was not cruel, but comfortable, where her worth was not measured by ridicule, where she began to believe she might have a place in the world after all. And though the mountains outside remained wild and cold, inside something warmer began to take root. Winter in the high country was merciless. Snowdrifts piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind howled down from the peaks with a voice like wolves. But within those log walls, life began to take on a rhythm, quiet, steady, almost tender. Eleanor had never known such steadiness. She woke each morning to the smell of wood smoke and the crackle of fire. Jed was always up before her, splitting logs in the yard or tending to the horses. Sometimes she would watch from the window as he worked, his arms swinging the axe with powerful precision, the breath rising from him in white clouds. There was a solidity about him, a sense that nothing could shake him, not even the mountain storms. At first Eleanor tiptoed through the cabin as though afraid to disturb him. She folded her blankets, neatly scrubbed the tin bowls after meals, and stayed quiet while he worked. But Jed never treated her as a burden. "You're not a guest here," he told her one evening. "This is your home as much as mine, so long as you stay." The words startled her. Home. It had been so long since she had belonged anywhere that the idea seemed foreign. But she began to test the weight of it little by little. She cleaned the shelves, humming softly as she worked. She baked bread in the old iron stove, the scent filling the cabin and making Jed pause his work to smile faintly. She patched his shirts, her fingers clumsy at first, but growing more confident with each stitch. Every small act made the cabin feel less like his and more like theirs. Jed's kindness came in small, wordless gestures. He always let her take food first. He placed the warmer quilt on her bed when nights grew bitter. When she dropped a bucket of water in the snow, he didn't scold, he simply helped her lift it again and showed her a better grip. One afternoon he surprised her with an axe. "You'll need to learn," he said. Her eyes widened. She had never wielded such a tool before. But Jed stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm and patient. "Steady your stance. Swing from the shoulders, not the wrists." Her first strike barely dented the log, but he didn't laugh. He only nodded. Again. After several tries, the wood split clean. A laugh burst from her lips, sharp and joyous, and Jed's answering smile was the rare kind that softened his entire face. Evenings became her favorite time. They sat by the fire, the storm outside raging. Yet inside the cabin there was warmth. Jed would mend his tools or carve wood, while Eleanor sewed or read from her father's old Bible. Sometimes they spoke little. Sometimes he asked her quiet questions about her childhood, about her mother's cooking, or the songs she used to sing. She found herself telling him things she had never said aloud before. One night she dared ask, "Why did you say that in town? Why claim me so boldly when everyone else wanted me gone?" Jed paused, the firelight etching lines into his weathered face. "Because you deserved better than their cruelty? Because I couldn't stand by and watch them tear you down?" His voice dropped lower. "Because I've seen the way you carry yourself with more strength than they'll ever know." Her eyes burned with tears. She tried to blink away. No one had ever spoken of her that way. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor grew stronger, her cheeks no longer hollow, her laughter no longer a stranger to her lips. She discovered she had a knack for keeping hens calm, for cooking stews that even Jed admitted tasted better than his. And though she still feared the outside world within these walls, she began to believe she could build something new. Yet shadows lingered. Sometimes in the stillness she would catch Jed staring into the fire, his expression heavy with memories he never shared. She sensed a sorrow buried deep, a story of loss that shaped the silence around him. And though he gave her safety, she wondered if he would ever let her into the part of himself that still lived in the dark. Still the cabin glowed with life. The storms battered the mountains, but inside two souls, once lost, once broken, began to knit themselves together in the quiet acts of survival, kindness, and something growing dangerously close to love. The mountain gave them peace, but Leadville was not far enough to silence its cruelties. Whispers drifted up with the traders who passed through stories of Sheriff Croft boasting that Jed Kane had claimed a beggar woman like a prize hog, that Eleanor was nothing but a meal ticket for a reclusive man. Eleanor tried to ignore it, but the words cut. At night, when Jed had gone to tend the fire outside, she stared at the quilt over her knees and wondered if the town truly believed she was worthless. Sometimes she even wondered if Jed, despite his kindness, might one day see her as they did. Then came the discovery. It happened on a gray morning when she was sweeping the corner by Jed's old trunk. The latch had loosened, and when she knelt to fix it, the lid shifted open. Inside were hunting knives, coils of rope, and beneath them a folded packet of yellowed papers. She pulled it free, meaning to set it aside, but as she glanced down, her breath caught. It was a survey map. The same signature leapt from the page, a name she knew well, her father's. Eleanor's heart pounded. She spread the papers out on the table. They were old legal documents stamped by the county granting water rights to her father's claim near the creek that cut through the valley. She remembered him mentioning it once before the mine collapse took him, but she had thought the records lost. Jed entered to find her staring at the map. His jaw tightened, but he didn't snatch it away. Instead, he came to stand beside her. "Where did you find that?" "In your trunk," she whispered. "Jed, this was my father's." He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I came across it years ago, before you wandered into town. I kept it safe because I knew Croft would bury it if he ever got hold of it. Your father's rights mean more than land, Eleanor. They mean water. And water is power." Her hands trembled. "So all this time, you knew I knew," Jed admitted. "But I didn't know it belonged to you until that night in town. When I saw how Croft treated you, I realized why he hated you so much. He knew you were the rightful heir to what he wanted." Eleanor's chest tightened with confusion. Part of her wanted to thank him for protecting the papers. Another part feared the whispers were true, that he had only brought her here for what she carried unknowingly in her bloodline. The silence between them stretched. At last she asked, "Did you save me because of this?" Jed's gaze locked on hers, steady and unflinching. "No. I saved you because no one else would. Because you deserved better. The papers only mean Croft won't stop until he destroys you. And that Eleanor is why we need to fight back." The words settled heavy in the room. For the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of choice on her shoulders. She could walk away, return to a life of wandering and hunger, or she could stay, claim what was hers, and face the sheriff head on. That night she lay awake, listening to Jed breathe steadily by the fire. His presence should have soothed her, but doubt gnawed at her heart. Was she strong enough to confront Croft? Was Jed telling her the whole truth? Or were there other ghosts in his past, hidden as carefully as the map in his trunk? Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains silent beneath the stars. But inside, two secrets, hers and his, had collided, and the peace of the cabin would never be the same again. The knock came just after dawn, sharp, commanding. Eleanor froze where she stood, a tin mug of water trembling in her hands. Jed set down his axe and opened the door. Sheriff Croft stood there, flanked by two armed deputies. Snow still clung to his boots, but his sneer was warm with malice. "You've hidden long enough, Kane," he said. "Time to hand the girl over. She's squatting on rights that belong to the county now." Jed blocked the doorway, his frame filling the space. "Those papers are hers by law and by blood. You know it." Croft's laugh was cold. "Law. Out here, law is whatever I say it is. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Step aside and maybe I'll let you keep your shack." Eleanor's fear burned into anger. For years she had shrunk from voices like his, but no more. She stepped forward until she stood shoulder to shoulder with Jed. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "You will not take what my father left me. You will not take my dignity again." Croft's eyes narrowed. "So the beggar girl finds her tongue. Be careful, or I'll cut it out." He gestured, and one deputy reached for his rifle. Jed's shotgun was already in his hands, angled low but ready. "Try it," he said, his voice a low growl. "See who bleeds first." The standoff stretched the cold air thick with breath and threat. Eleanor felt Jed's hand brush against hers, not pulling her back, but grounding her steady as stone. "You're outnumbered," Croft spat. Jed's gaze never wavered. "Outgunned, too. But I'm not the one who has to explain to the judge why a sheriff shot an unarmed woman over a creek." Croft's sneer faltered. Behind him the deputies shifted uneasily, doubt flickering in their eyes. They had signed on for pay, not for murder in broad daylight. The silence broke when Eleanor lifted her chin and said, clear enough for all to hear, "I will stand in front of the whole town if I must. Everyone will know the truth that you forged records and tried to steal from the dead." Her words landed like a hammer. One deputy lowered his rifle. The other followed. Croft's face darkened, rage and fear warring within him. He spat into the snow, then yanked his coat tight. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." With that, he turned, stomping back down the trail, his men trailing behind him. For a long moment the world was still. Eleanor's knees threatened to give way, but Jed's hand steadied her. He looked down at her with something fierce and proud in his eyes. "You stood," he said softly. She nodded, breathless. "With you, I always will." And in that frozen clearing, surrounded by snow and silence, they knew the battle had only begun, but they would face it together. Winter lingered, but the cabin stood stronger than ever, its walls bearing the scars of wind and storm, just as its two inhabitants bore the scars of their own battles. Eleanor moved through its rooms no longer as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She baked bread that filled the air with warmth, fed the hens with steady hands, and split wood with a strength she had never imagined she possessed. Each act was a quiet defiance against the voices that once told her she was nothing. Jed watched her, though he rarely said much. His words came sparingly, but his actions spoke in volumes, laying the warmest quilt across her shoulders, before bed repairing the soles of her shoes without being asked, leaving her the last cup of stew when he knew she was still hungry. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Eleanor dared to ask the question that had lived in her chest since that night in Leadville. "Do you regret it? Standing up for me in front of them all?" Jed looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "Not once. You belong here, Eleanor. With me. This cabin, this life, it's yours, if you'll have it." Her breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes. She nodded slowly, the truth filling her like fire. "Then I'll have it. All of it." Outside the mountains loomed vast and unforgiving, the world below still full of enemies and whispers. But inside the cabin, beneath the glow of the hearth, they had carved out something stronger than fear, something fragile, yet fierce, like love itself. The question that lingered was simple, yet vast. Would that love be enough to withstand the world waiting beyond their mountain walls? Stories like Eleanor and Jed's remind us that love is not about perfection, but about courage, the courage to see worth where the world only sees weakness. From shame and loneliness, they built dignity and hope, proving that even in the harshest winters, warmth can be found. Where are you listening from tonight? Share your thoughts. I'd love to know. And if you believe that love can still redeem, protect, and restore, then stay with me. Because the next story I tell may be the one that speaks straight to your heart.